One question that we always get is how likely jail is for a DUI first conviction. Now, a DUI conviction carries mandatory jail times. This means that the prosecutor does not have the authority to waive the jail time if you're convicted of a DUI. Now, there's different levels of jail sentences depending on what exactly your charge is. So, with a DUI first, if your blood is between a zero point zero 0.08 and a 0.15, there's a mandatory 48 hours in jail. If your blood level is above that 0.15, it is enhanced to 7 days in jail. And then additionally, if child endangerment is also part of your DUI where you had children in the vehicle, then that is enhanced to 32 days in jail. It's an additional 30 days plus the 48-hour mandatory. Now again, if your blood is that 0.15 level, then it's actually 37 days. It's that 7-day enhancement along with the additional 30 for that child endangerment.
And that's only if you are convicted of DUI, right?
Yes, and that's only if you're convicted of a DUI. And that's why it's really important to have an attorney advocating for you on your behalf. Sometimes we can get creative and come with resolutions that aren't necessarily a DUI conviction. Dakota, do you want to talk about kind of what we work around for a DUI?
Yeah. So when the state is looking at prosecuting a DUI case, the two things that they're going to be most concerned with are safety of the community and making sure that it doesn't happen again. We can get creative, and Brandon says it a lot. The punishment has to fit the crime. In our negotiations with the prosecutor, we can come to them with offers to resolve cases short of a DUI. Things like a reckless driving or a misdemeanor reckless endangerment, an aggravated reckless driving, or even all the way up to a felony reckless endangerment, which sounds worse than a misdemeanor DUI. However, all of those charges or potential convictions that I just mentioned are eligible for what's called judicial diversion. A judicial diversion allows it to be dismissed and expunged after certain conditions are met. Brandon, do you want to talk about some conditions that we can get creative with in pitching these potential alternate resolutions?
Yeah, so like Dakota mentioned, we really focus on, does the punishment fit the crime? Also, can the state prove their case? We look for every legal issue possible, and then in conjunction, show the prosecutor, even if you think you can get past this legal issue, why they should not want to get past it and convict our specific client. So we look at, their employment position. We look at, do they drive for a living? We look at whether they have children or elderly parents that rely on them. So we can talk about what makes that person a person and show the prosecutor who that person is. And so it really gets, dependent on the individual. In some cases, we may recommend a scram, which is an ankle monitoring device, monitors your sweat glands for alcohol, ensures complete sobriety from alcohol. When we talk to clients about that, they always have the question, well, if being convicted of DUI requires an ignition interlock, no drinking and driving, but I can drink whenever I want otherwise, why would I want to agree to that scram? And like Dakota mentioned, that's when it becomes important to show a prosecutor, why they're not a threat to the community, because they aren't heavy drinkers. They are willing to prove it to the prosecutor, prove it to the court by not drinking alcohol at all for 6 months or a year if it means avoiding the jail time and that DUI conviction. There's community service. Technology is also evolving daily, as we can see, living our daily lives. Specific with that scram, there's also a remote breath option. I got an email a few weeks ago. There is now essentially a Fitbit that you can wear on your wrist, just like that bulky, heavy ankle monitor, the scram on your ankle, but no one would even know. They would think it's just a Fitbit or a Apple Watch, something like that now is an option. So as we evolve with our technology, there are more options that are becoming available. And as defense attorneys, it is important that we are constantly, knowledgeable about the evolving technologies to discuss it with prosecutors and coming to, what we think is a reasonable outcome as it applies to our specific clients to avoid that mandatory jail time, the DUI being on your record for the rest of your life, in finding a way to get it diversion eligible, like Dakota mentioned. At the end of the day, every case is different, but that means that the outcomes should be different as well, and that there's different ways that we can ensure the community's safety and ensure this doesn't happen again without ruining someone's life. And so that's what we really want to focus on, which leads to, as far as that goes, if there was just no way to avoid a DUI conviction, the jail time is mandatory, right? Or is there any other option?
So, like Brandon and Emily were talking about, generally that jail time is going to be mandatory. That is what the statute intends. And for those cases where, whether it came down from 32 to 48 hours or from 7 days to 48 hours, there are some limited exceptions where you can get credit for the jail time. So here in East Tennessee, we would call it like the DUI Education Center. And the principle of it is you don't get any of the jail credit for what you've already served, but you would go to this facility where you would spend 48 hours there in lieu of serving that time in the jail. And the statute does allow for that. Now, you're not entitled to it, right? It's something that has to be negotiated for, requested by the judge, or negotiated with through the prosecutor. But when we talk about punishment fitting the crime, and when we talk about trying to show a prosecutor who you are and that the sentence fits, is if at the conclusion of that, there's no other way around the DUI, the Temperance Academy or the DUI Education Center or one of the other facilities can be a way to avoid doing that dreaded 48 hours in jail. And so what it is you spend your time there, you're able to complete your DUI school, there's some individual therapy sessions, and it's more focused on rehabilitation rather than the 48 hours of incarceration and separation from society. So thankfully, like you talk about with the developments in technology, we're also seeing a trend where it's moving a little more towards reform. But it is something that while it's allowed, it is by no means a guarantee. So it's something that we're always trying to advocate for in the event that there's no way around the DUI, but there's ways that we try to get there, whether it be through certain conditions or having you do an alcohol and drug assessment to demonstrate to the prosecutor that 48 hours is best served there rather than in the local jail.
Yeah, so it's a private facility. It used to
Yes.
be a hotel or a motel that closed down, became this facility. You also mentioned a second ago reducing a case from 7 days to 48 hours or 32 days to 48 hours. So if I'm driving a vehicle, I have a kid in the vehicle, it's 32 days mandatory minimum is what Emily said earlier. That's if convicted at a jury trial. The judge
Yes.
cannot give you less than that. But can a prosecutor agree to less than the 32 days? Or if your blood's above a 0.15, can they agree to less than 7 days?
Yeah, absolutely. Is kind of like what you were talking about earlier, is when we talk about having people do conditions on the front end, right? Is things that they can do to demonstrate their sincerity, take accountability for what happened, and try to show a prosecutor that they are not a threat to society, right? So what Brandon's talking about there is that if you go to jury trial and lose, yes, those mandatory sentences that Emily was talking about, that is the absolute least that you can get. But throughout negotiations, there are ways that, God forbid, there be a kid in the car, we can still try to negotiate down to 48 hours, or, if we can't avoid the DUI altogether, it's just these are the mandatories for if you were convicted as charged.
Yeah.
So negotiations are still always going to be very important to try to avoid those mandatory enhancements or the mandatory minimums.